Turning on the recording. Look at that. Judy, thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to jump right into the interview. So, very first question we have is why HR and why do you stay doing it?
I got into HR by accident, but I found that I had a real love for it, and it is a way to be able to help organizations maximize productivity through their HR practices and their environment that they create for employees.
Excellent. So before HR Answers, which is, are we 36 years?
37
37. Okay.
and a half.
And a half, even better. What types of organizations did you work for prior to HR Answers?
I worked in healthcare. I worked in finance at a savings and loan. I was also a part of a group home for foster kids, and we had 7 teenagers at girls at a time. That was the best preparation for HR anybody could ever have.
Teenage girls?
Teenage girls.
Okay. I do find myself on occasion when working with clients thinking about, wow, I think I had this conversation with one of my kids when they were younger at some point in time. I understand the correlation.
Right. We had 47 girls in a 6-year period. So as a result, there were tremendous number of personalities that I needed to adjust to.
Yeah. And there is HR adjusting too, no question. There's lots of change going on these days. So at HR Answers, what kind of organizations did you work with?
It would be easier for me to answer what type of organizations I haven't worked with, because they are small to huge. They are in every sector of the SIC codes. So it's organizations who want to improve or have discovered that they have an issue relative to the atmosphere that they create for employees.
So in all the various things that we do in HR, what's your current passion? My assumption is that's probably changed over the years.
Yeah, it has. I am now really into avoiding lawsuits. That's what I really would like to do. I'm doing expert witness work for organizations that have been sued, and organizations that are defending themselves from lawsuits. And I discovered that it is often that an organization has not followed its own policies and procedures, has not documented what they do, and that if they had done that, they would not be experiencing lawsuits. And so it's really a case of organizations need to think about risk and then audit what they're doing relative to their own practices, because I find that they have a practice that's not in line with their policy, and they're inconsistent in applying either the practice or the policy, and that makes them vulnerable.
Judy, do you think those inconsistencies come from change in personnel, or the fact that it's so old we didn't think it was relevant anymore?
I think the inconsistencies come between as a result of HR perhaps writing the policies, getting them blessed by management, but they don't, and maybe even they train managers once, but there's turnover in management and supervisors. And I promise none of that training that the previous manager or supervisor got relative to harassment or documentation of omissions or violations of employees. None of that gets transferred to the new folks. And so they bring what they did at their previous employer, which isn't at all about the way that it's supposed to be done in that employer. I have one case right now where I wrote a report because the employer's being sued. And when asked in their deposition, do you reference or use the handbook to guide any of your decisions? And the manager said, I didn't know I was supposed to. And then there was the follow-up question about policies. No, no one told me I was supposed to read those. And this is in a unionized environment. So then the last question was, what about the collective bargaining agreement? And the manager said, I don't think I even have a copy. So under those circumstances, the employer is significantly vulnerable to the lawsuit that's being brought.
Yeah. Wow. Supervisor onboarding, manager onboarding, training, all things that I think
Yes.
every HR person has said repeatedly. And I think one of the frustrations I know you and I have talked about before, but we also still experience when budget gets tight, training goes away. And those are fundamental, they're foundational components for people to be successful and mitigate risk. I mean, it's both. And as much work as goes into a collective bargaining agreement or writing a new policy or writing a new handbook or revising it, one would think you'd want to maximize that.
Absolutely.
They're not small
And
tasks.
you cannot train too much. And training can be quizzes. Training can be a variety of things to refresh the memories of all the people who are most impacted.
Yeah. So if avoiding lawsuits is the passion, why? Why is that the thing right now that gets you going?
Dealing with a lawsuit steals so many otherwise productive hours. You are talking about attorney fees and hours in consultation. You are talking about what happened to other people. So therefore, there's all this time spent in research about how we handle leaves for employee XYZ and how is it different than. There's a tremendous burden on the organization that in essence steals from the productivity, steals from the positivity, and as a result, being able to avoid lawsuits gives back all of that time and energy and productivity to the employer.
Yeah. Hate a litigation hold associated with records. Those we used to hate those, or the voluminous record request. Give me everything that you've ever said about so and so in email.
Yes.
Ah.
Yes, and those impact the IT department, they impact HR, they impact the department and its whole management as well as employee. and sometimes it becomes public, and then it damages the reputation of the organization, even if they're successful at trial.
Mhm.
That article that went out, that headline, it can impact whether or not people apply there for work.
Well, and at a time when recruitment and applications and finding qualified people is at an all-time low, organizations need every help they can possibly get in the
Yes.
positive marketing arena.
Right.
I mean, there have been some pretty heady headlines lately, just in our local Portland metro area. Walmart, $4.4 million.
Yes.
We've got Nike with a new settlement as of last Friday. I mean, there's just a number of different ones, and it makes, as a practitioner, it makes me think, how does an organization that size go
Question.
so far astray when
Yes.
you read those actual cases, not just the newspaper, read the actual case. When you look at that and you just think, wow, the bad facts just keep stacking up.
Yeah, and it is so very often the first line supervisor or manager that doesn't think something's important, doesn't jot notes about Johnny and his policy violation. And so the organization is frequently undone by first level managers and supervisors who don't see themselves as HR people, and they aren't, but really have not been invested in the policy application, or understanding the impact of what they're doing.
Yep. I know Deborah and I both in supervisory training now talk about things like management's an active sport. And that means active on your part, staying curious, staying interested, seeking the answers to those questions, not just saying, well, I don't know, so do whatever you want. That's not active management.
No, and for exempt employees who are paid to do the job, not the hours they work, if they aren't spending a couple of hours a week getting caught up on compliance or policies, or going to talk with another manager who's been there much longer and glean information from them, they're really not doing the job.
And the reality is, I don't think organizations are hiring poor managers or poor supervisors. They just aren't finishing the rest of the task. I mean, I talked about the fact there's no car wash that you come out the end of and poof, you're a supervisor or a manager. You know, it's work. You have to learn this stuff. And I mean,
Right.
I was a really good compensation person for many, many years. And then I moved into supervision, and thank heaven I had an excellent manager who talked to me about things like, no, your employees are now your first responsibility. That does take precedence, because if that doesn't work right, nothing works right. You got to
Right.
get there. And held my hand through that. And quite honestly, she still holds my hand on occasion. So
It's good to have resources
it
when
is.
you're faced with okay, what do I do now kind of question.
Yeah, absolutely. So Judy, on the topic of avoiding litigation, what are some of the main considerations you think HR professionals need to think about?
I think HR professionals do a relatively good job of saying document, but I don't think they then elaborate on that and say, here's what a good documentation note is. Here's what I share with Johnny, because I want him to know that I made a note about this. And when I make notes, if they happen again, I'm likely to include them in your performance evaluation. And that's a whole other thing. I've got one case right now where they say they do performance evaluations on an annual basis. And I have at least 6 people in this case who say, I've been here for 7 years and I've had one evaluation. What do you remember about it? Well, I remember we talked about long-term goals. Well, was there any conversation about your current performance or any place where you could improve? No, I don't think so. Mostly it was about long-term goals. Oh, that's not a performance evaluation. And these seem to be done at random, not methodically every year. And so it's hard if there's no documentation and if there's no performance evaluations being done. How do you make a case that, in fact, an employee can't stay with you, needs to be terminated? But what we have is in the last 3 days, we have all these notes about Johnny's always done, Johnny never did, etc. And that's an invitation for litigation.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Yeah, I used to talk about my evaluations for individuals having coffee rings on them because they were notebooks. It was an ongoing piece, and it was then discussion with them about a period of time, usually annually, and then written documentation that made it to the personnel file. So it's not just that documentation. And I always like that SBI method, and again, something Deborah trains about, specific behavior and its impact. But impact for me is, what was the policy? So let's go back to that handbook. Let's go back to why it is that this is a problem in the organization.
Right.
And why we need it fixed. And then stick with it.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah. It's both actions and behaviors. Yeah. I personally have an adverse reaction when one of the plaintiffs, for instance, says, I was constantly yelled at. It was like this guy didn't have any lower vocal capability. I bet he never whispered in his life. He just yells across the floor and tells you to do something. And I have problems with that. Even if the direction's the right direction, it's how it is given to employees.
Yeah. Yeah. The how and the what.
Yes.
Seemingly important. Those are always fun discussions too. Pay for performance. Are you paying only for how or only for what, or some measurement of both? Yes. How are we going to look at that? And, you and I have been through a million of those discussions, I'm sure. And interestingly enough, companies are usually interested in both.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which then means document both, please.
Yes.
Helpful.
And HR could help by making a note sheet. HR could help if it's a plant and manufacturing, etc., and all the supervisors and managers are wearing shirts with a little pocket. I said, you've got a pocket, put one of those little spiral bound notebooks in your pocket, pull it out and say, Johnny thus and so. And don't forget to say, and Johnny was wonderful taking over such and such. That way you've got compliments as well as concerns. And sometimes performance evaluations are 99% concerns, and the employee has to recover from that conversation. And that's not what a performance evaluation or documentation is meant to be.
Yeah. Well, and if you're not a fan of the paper, these cell phones tend to fit nicely in those pockets too. And they've got a note feature. Whatever it is, just get it written down, make it part of the record. And I appreciate the compliment as well as the concern, because I think if we're really even handed, if we really stick with it all the time, the compliments frequently outshine the concerns.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You do a wonderful job of all these things. This is the area where I would ask for you to consider improvement. And maybe after we finish this session, you can think about it a bit, and then we can talk further about it and how I can help. Because supervisors and managers are there to answer questions, to help employees, to guide employees to greater skills. And if you're doing that throughout the whole organization, it's unlikely that you're going to have litigation.
Yeah. So talking about skills, tools, what tools are there available out there for people who are trying to navigate this?
I think there's a variety of them, and probably time doesn't permit us to list all, but a couple of them are style inventories or assessments, so that you have a sense of how this employee receives information. What's the most important part? Some employees are rapid fire, back and forth conversation off the top of their heads, and they're really comfortable with that. Other folks need to think about it, need to figure out how it might work for them or what part might not work for them, and they process. We had a vice president in HR Answers who I knew was a thinker, and I'm a rapid fire off the top of my head. And so I had to learn that I would present information or make a request, and then I would say, why don't we get together tomorrow afternoon at 3 and we can talk about how you think this might work. Yes, it meant that I had to be patient, but I got a whole lot better result because I gave that time. And he felt like he could really delve into it and think about all the consequences. He was better about thinking about consequences than I was, and I depended on him to do that for us. And so I think style. Second of all, what is the thing that you know about them individually and in groups? Because if you're going to bring the whole group together, how do you make room for all the different styles? I will tell you that one of the things I am absolutely proudest of relative to HR Answers is one time we did all the Myers-Briggs. Each of us did the Myers-Briggs, and then we reported our results. Myers-Briggs gives you 16 different types with their I don't like the word personality, but with their personality, their communications, their work, thought processes. And the thing that I was proudest of is we had 15 of those 16 types on staff. One, it meant I hadn't hired like me, and that is really important. Know yourself and hire for expertise that you don't have or for style you don't have. And that was really critical. So the other thing I would say is you need to go to a negotiation class or read books on negotiation so that you are prepared to have a give and take, not just dump whatever the new project or the new style or the new policy, etc., You can't just dump them on employees. Well, I'm sorry, you can dump them on employees, just don't expect it to work very well and expect there to be some residual chit chat about things. The other thing that I think you have to recognize is that HR walks in the middle of employees and organizations, and they seek to have solutions or ideas, etc., that work for both of those populations. If you ever don't keep yourself in the middle, if it is seen by the employees that you are taking a hard management line in everything, if it is seen by management that you're always pleading the case of some poor, vulnerable employee, you will not be effective in your organization. So you have to stay in the middle. And it doesn't mean you can't make a case for an employee situation. It doesn't mean that you can't articulate the rationale for a policy change. It just means that you have to be able to be seen by both groups as professional, as listening. And that's probably another tool that's really important, is listening. And then there are all the things that comprise the HR world: job descriptions, pay ranges, all of those kinds of things. And so if you're in charge of it all, or if you're a generalist, then you have to try and learn as much as you can about that so that you can properly answer any question from management or employees.
Yeah, and it's a balancing act. It's a
It
balancing
is.
act. Yep, absolutely. So Judy, what are some missteps that you have seen through either some of your cases, and you've probably covered a little of this already, but missteps that you've seen in working through or trying to avoid litigation?
Sometimes jobs are not well defined. And so an employee can take on one or two extra things, but if they are just dumped on, and I'm using that word too much, if they're just assigned new things without the support and without an explanation about how this fits into their job, then there can be some it's a misstep to not be able to define that. It's perfectly appropriate for management to assign work, but you have to be careful not to assign so much work that the basic duties have to step aside. Not prioritizing things for people. That is a misstep, because I'm over here doing A, B, and C, and I'm doing a wonderful job of it, but you want D and E done as a priority. It's just that you didn't tell me. The other thing is that is a misstep is not paying attention to small complaints. So if I complain at one time, and I'm talking to my cohort over here, and I'm saying, I told my boss that I was now pregnant and would need a family medical leave in 3 months or so. And he said, oh, well, thanks for letting me know. And that report I asked you to write, don't worry about that, because I'm going to take it back. I'm going to suggest that maybe you want to go home when you get to the late stages of pregnancy. I'm going to suggest Well, you just don't need to be part of XYZ, because they think they're being magnanimous. I think that's close. But they really aren't. They're damaging my ability to work. They are saying, because you are pregnant, and pregnant is a status that only females can have. So therefore you are treating females differently than males. And if I come to you and say, the doctor says, and I have a note that I need to go home for bed rest now that I'm 8 months or 7 months pregnant, that's one thing. But for a manager or supervisor to decide I need to go home when there is no medical reason for that and I want to work, those are missteps. So sometimes missteps come out of goodwill, but they are missteps just the same.
Yep. The law doesn't seem to care whether well-intentioned or not.
No,
So it's that outcome that's the unfortunate part.
right.
Good. So what's the best success story that you've seen? What's something that done really well?
There was an organization several years ago that I audited their HR practices and their materials, their personnel files, etc. And I wrote an audit report, and I identified the things that they were doing wonderfully well. And I identified half dozen, 6 or 7 areas where they were conspicuously vulnerable. And I sat down with them and talked about what those vulnerabilities were and why I was concerned for them about those. And they said, okay, if we give you a timetable of how we're going to address these and follow your recommendations, will you come out every month and talk with us about whether or not we've hit a home run on it or not? So they didn't just want an audit. They wanted approval of change. They wanted suggestions about how to do this one because it felt really awkward. And they worked diligently, one of those a month for 7, I think it was 7 months. And I was so proud of them. I just can't tell you. And I asked if I could come out, and they had every 6 months a all employee, and they had about 70 employees. So every seat was filled and there was standing room at the back. And they allowed me to talk with them about what I found, what the company did about it. And then I got to add my tagline and say, this is the first time I have ever had an opportunity to come talk to an entire company because they're committed to doing good HR. And I was able to talk with them and just pat them on the back a ton. Most organizations look at it, the audit report, figure there's 1 or 2 things that wouldn't take much effort, and they put it aside. And then after several months, it's completely forgotten. And I have often thought of that as somehow a personal failure to be able to make people understand how really important this is. Organizations want to be profitable. One of the things that can drain profitability is a lawsuit or two. And even if they have employment practices liability insurance, there's a deductible on the front end and there's a cap on the insurance policy. And if you have a couple of those, you'll find rapidly that no one will insure you for employment practices. So now you're on the hook for all of it. I have one case now where this is the third case for the same employer for the same reasons. And I will simply say the board needs to allow that executive director to go off and rest for a long time.
A nice
It
way of
is.
putting it, Judy.
Yeah, it is. It's not pretty.
Yeah, it is frustrating. And I think many HR professionals have seen that on the employee side of things, that we give the opportunity, we put it out there, we show them all the ways they can get there, give them the training, give them all of those components, and they just don't get there. And at some point in time, it is okay to say goodbye, as long as we have all that great documentation to go along with it. But yeah, and those are hard circumstances when you see that repetitive churn. And back to some of those initial statements you made, what's that doing to how that organization is seen in its community, how it's seen in its industry? How much more damaging is it than just the check they had to write at the end of each of those for their failures, their repeated failures? And at some point in time, it's just willful.
I honestly believe that this gentleman functions in a world where, because he's the top of the pyramid in his organization, that he can do whatever he wants. And evidently the monetary impact of the two previous ones has not been sufficient for him to change his ways. But there is a growing understanding in the organization that you just need to avoid him if possible. That's a really unfortunate consequence.
Absolutely. Okay, so tips and tricks. You already talked about a few of these: documentation, communication, training.
Right.
All really important.
I would say, and I don't know that it's a tip or trick, but solicit feedback. Honestly solicit feedback for managers, supervisors, and other folks who are part of the executive world. Ask if you make a presentation telling them about some new compliance requirement, ask a half a dozen people afterwards, did that make sense? Is there something that would be helpful? When I was inside organizations, I always found a couple of people who'd been with the organization a while, who weren't necessarily supervisors, but I would share my overheads with them about, is there something you still have a question about? Do these bullets make sense, etc. So I got feedback from the folks who were the target audience, and it made me feel more comfortable. And there were times when they had a great insight. So find yourself a couple of three and expand that. Don't always go back to the same folks, because they will view it with the same lens they viewed everything else. So you want to test, it's test marketing, and you want to do that before you embark on something, so that it's clear and the end result is what you intended.
Excellent. So one more thing. Out of everything you've learned in HR, what is one piece of advice that you give to other professionals?
HR is staff, not line. So therefore, it can't make something happen all by itself. They have to get permission, or they have to be assigned as a particular project. And so you can't, HR is about effective persuasion. And that is really important. And you may not be successful persuading the first time you tackle it, but then you need to understand what the concerns are in the company or the organization. What do we need to change? We have to understand the impact of that. But I've always operated by an acronym that somebody told me about, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago. And the acronym is GARP, G-A-R-P. And it's gently apply persistence pressure. The idea is you come back to that. I read another article about that, and I wanted to share it with you to see whether or not you found it interesting. Would you like me to have an eye out for this information and provide it to you?
Yes.
I was wondering about our previous conversation in which you said, no, I don't think it's necessary regarding whatever. I wanted to let you know I had lunch with so-and-so, and they started doing this about a year ago, and they're very successful at it. Would you like me to do an invitation between you and their CEO or their distribution manager, whatever, so that you can see how it works? It's gently apply, relentless. In other words, you don't give up pressure. It never feels like you're shoving. You're never pushing somebody along. You aren't threatening. You are gently applying pressure, relentless pressure. And I think that's some of the best advice for HR. I know it made a difference in how I presented things. And so as a result, I was much more successful. And when I was assistant administrator of a hospital, the other folks who were a part of management or department heads used to say, how do you get to do anything you want to do? And I say, it's not about I want to, it's about I helped him understand what was beneficial and could make a difference. And so I got permission to implement what he thought would matter. Mm-hmm. So it's managing up and doing a good job of explaining what the benefit to the organization would be numerous times if necessary.
Yeah. And again, that coming back to your previous statement of that being in the middle.
Yes.
The balance of all of those things. And I was taught really early on, those are your customers. No different than if you have, a widget that you're selling, everybody that you talk to that could use it is your customer. Every employee is your customer. The management of the organization is your customer. They're your customers. Yeah. We keep working at it till we figure out how it works best.
Yes.
Yeah. Not an easy task some days, tiring. And quite
No.
honestly, lately it's been very difficult with reduced staffing. When you were talking about the, don't pile on too much work or don't dump the work on them. It's like, I cannot tell you how many phone calls we've had
Yes.
lately around, people are saying, I just can't take on anymore. And the news articles that have been out lately about the quiet quitter, the definition being that person who's setting boundaries for themselves. And I appreciate looking at other HR professionals pushing back on the concept of the fact that somehow that's wrong. No, it isn't wrong. Employees should have a reasonable expectation to not get burned out by going to work.
Absolutely.
They should be able to say, I can turn it off. I can move on to something else. And that is just, if you have less people, you might be able to accomplish less. And that's just the stark reality that some business owners will have to face.
Yes.
In a time where we can't find the people that we need. It's not necessarily HR's not doing their job. And that's, I've watched a few too many posts, I think, lately, of leaders and organizations ranting about the fact that, well, we just need to hire more recruiters, or we just need to, it's like, no, don't see, that's not the issue. The issue is there aren't people to get.
Right.
Unless somehow you know how to clone, I think it's a difference in looking at what we as businesses need from our employee base and then being thoughtful about those evaluations. But because all of this just tells me more litigation's coming. More litigation's coming.
I am concerned about the type of litigation, and the fact that it doesn't need to happen. So if we educate supervisors and managers thoroughly about these things, and we can help them understand why it is important, that's one key. If we have good policies and practices, and we ensure that there is information, if there's an intranet, all you need to do is track whether or not everybody who's supposed to sign in on that does, and so that the people who don't, then you need to make an extra effort and have a conversation. And if you create, I want to say fun, if you create a positive environment and the employees know that they are genuinely cared about, that's really the beginning of positive employment and a very productive and successful organization.
Absolutely. Lots to keep in balance, that's for sure.
Right. Now I just have to go about doing all the things I said.
That's right. Well, the daily challenge of being good at what you do, which I think is what all employees are really after when they come to work.
Yes.
I am still a pretty firm believer that people don't come to work to do a bad job.
Nope. No.
I just don't think that's true.
No, and they don't want to be corrected and criticized all the time either for the job that they are doing when they think they're doing their best. And if it's not their best, then it's the organization's responsibility to see whether or not they can do their best. Because that's what you're supposed to hire, is somebody who can and somebody who will, who wants to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Judy, thank you so much for spending almost an hour with us today. And I am sure that we will have questions that we can filter off to you. Judy's email address will be available on the next set of slides. So thank you. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I love to talk HR. So this was just great fun.
Good deal.
All right. Bye.
Bye.